Marcus had already signed the divorce papers. The pen was still lying on the kitchen table when he drove back to the house he no longer felt he belonged in, only because he had forgotten his father's old watch on the dresser. He did not intend to overhear anything. But as he passed the living room, quiet on his own feet, out of habit rather than intention, he heard his mother-in-law's voice rise sharply from behind the half-closed door. "Are you really planning to stay with him for the rest of your life?" Patricia asked, and Marcus froze in the hallway with his hand still on the doorframe. Then he heard his wife answer with a single sentence that undid 3 months of certainty in less than 5 seconds. In that instant, the woman he believed had stopped loving him, revealed a secret he had never known in 11 years of marriage, and everything he thought he understood about his own life began to come apart. For most of those 11 years, people had looked at Marcus and Danielle the way people look at something they wish they had. He was 39, a senior construction engineer who had built his reputation one careful decision at a time, the kind of man who checked the math twice before he ever spoke a number out loud. She was 37, a corporate attorney with a mind that moved faster than most rooms could keep up with, the kind of woman who walked into negotiations already 3 steps ahead of everyone else at the table. Friends used to say they balanced each other, his stillness against her fire, and for a long time that balance had looked effortless from the outside. Danielle used to laugh with her whole body, throwing her head back at something Marcus said under his breath, and he used to catch himself staring at her across a room just to remember he was lucky. There had been a version of their marriage where silence meant comfort instead of distance, where a shared glance across a dinner table said more than most people managed to say in an hour of conversation. They had met 11 years earlier at a friend's engagement dinner, seated together purely by accident of a seating chart neither of them had any say in. Marcus remembered being struck less by anything she said that first night and more by the way she listened, fully, without checking her phone or glancing past his shoulder for someone more interesting to talk to. Danielle remembered him as quiet, in a way that felt deliberate rather than shy, a man who chose his words carefully because he actually meant them. They married 2 years later, in a small ceremony. Neither of them had wanted to make into a spectacle, just close family and a handful of friends in a backyard strung with lights. The early years had been full of the ordinary happiness that people rarely think to document properly. Weekend drives with no destination, arguments over nothing that ended in laughter, the quiet certainty that they had chosen well. Neither of them could have said, looking back, exactly when that ease had started slipping away from them. Only that it had, slowly enough, that neither one noticed until it was mostly gone. That version of them had been gone for a while before Marcus admitted it to himself. Dinners had become quiet in a different way. Not restful but hollow, 2 people chewing in the same room without anything left to say to each other. The hug at the door before work had stopped happening sometime that spring, though neither of them had marked the exact day it disappeared. Marcus noticed that Danielle no longer looked for his eyes when she walked into a room, and he told himself it did not matter, though it mattered every single time. Conversations that used to stretch past midnight, about nothing in particular, had shrunk down to logistics. Who was picking up dry cleaning? Whether the mortgage payment had gone through? Nothing that required either of them to actually be present. He assumed she had simply stopped loving him, quietly and without cruelty. The way people sometimes drift out of feelings, the way tide pulls away from shore. So he moved his things into the home office down the hall, told himself it was for convenience, and waited to see if she would ask him to come back. She never did. Not once in the 4 months that followed did Danielle knock on that door and ask why he was sleeping somewhere else in a house they owned together. Marcus took her silence as confirmation of something he had already decided was true. And once a person decides a thing is true, every following detail seems to prove it further. He stopped initiating anything, not conversation, not affection, not plans for the future they used to talk about so easily. Somewhere in that stretch of cold, careful distance, Marcus began to believe he was watching the slow, dignified ending of a marriage that had simply run its course, the way many marriages do, without villains and without a single dramatic moment to blame. He grieved it privately while still living inside it, which is its own particular kind of loneliness, mourning something that has not technically ended yet. And so, on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in early spring, Marcus drove to a law office downtown and signed his name at the bottom of a document that made all of it official. The evidence, as Marcus understood it then, had been accumulating for months, small and separate, and easy to dismiss on their own, but devastating stacked together. Danielle started coming home later, sometimes past 9, always with an explanation that sounded plausible and always delivered a little too quickly. Her phone had become an extension of her hand, face down on tables, buzzing constantly, carried into rooms she used to leave it out of entirely. She answered his texts in single words now: fine, okay, later, where whole sentences used to live. Their 6th anniversary had passed without her mentioning it at all, and Marcus had sat with the reservation he made at their old restaurant, canceling it quietly before she ever knew it existed. When he floated the idea of a trip that fall, somewhere warm, somewhere far from both of their jobs, she had shut it down within seconds, citing work, always citing work, until the excuse itself became its own kind of answer. There were smaller things, too, the kind that only add up to something when a person is already looking for reasons to believe the worst. Danielle had stopped asking about his day the way she used to, the detailed questions about a job site or a difficult client that once made him feel like his work actually mattered to someone. She had started taking calls in the car, in the driveway, before coming inside, sitting out there sometimes for 20 minutes with the engine off. And when he asked who it was, she said work, always work, in a tone that discouraged further questions. Marcus noticed she had stopped wearing the bracelet he gave her for her 35th birthday. A small thing, the kind of detail a person tells himself does not mean anything, right up until it becomes one more brick in a wall he is quietly building. He began keeping a mental ledger, without ever admitting to himself that he was doing it. Each missed dinner, and each short answer another entry in a case he was building against his own marriage. A colleague named Gregory, a structural engineer Marcus had known for a decade, made an offhand comment one evening over drinks that landed harder than Gregory could have intended. He said it sounded like Danielle just wasn't interested in the marriage anymore, said it the way men say things they think are helpful, without weighing what the words might do once they took root. Marcus did not argue with him, because by then he did not have anything left to argue with. He drove home that night, turning the sentence over and over, and somewhere on that drive it stopped being Gregory's observation and became his own conviction. Within 2 weeks he had a name for a divorce attorney, an older woman named Ruth Caldwell, who had a reputation for being both thorough and quiet about it. Marcus sat across from her, describing 11 years of marriage in clinical, careful language, the way he might describe a load-bearing wall that had finally given out after years of invisible stress. They began dividing things methodically, the way Marcus divided everything: spreadsheets and folders and appointments scheduled 2 weeks out. The house would need to be appraised. The retirement accounts would need untangling. Ruth Caldwell asked him more than once if he was certain, and each time Marcus answered yes, without hesitation, because certainty was the only thing he had left to hold on to. A court date got set for a Thursday in late autumn, printed on a document that felt more real than almost anything else in his life at that point. He told no one outside of Gregory and his brother, kept the whole unraveling contained and quiet, the same way he had kept quiet through every stage of the marriage's decline. By the time the court date arrived on the calendar, Marcus had made peace with an ending he assumed had already happened somewhere out of his sight, long before the paperwork made it official. His brother Terence had asked him once, over a phone call late on a Sunday, whether he was completely sure this was the right move, whether there was anything left worth trying to fix before he made it permanent. Marcus had answered with the same certainty he gave Ruth Caldwell, the same certainty he had been repeating to himself for months, that some things simply run their course, and there is no dignity in pretending otherwise. Terence had not pushed further, though something in the pause before he changed the subject suggested he was not fully convinced. There were nights, alone in that home office with the door closed, when Marcus allowed himself a flicker of doubt, wondering if he had ever actually asked Danielle what was wrong, instead of simply deciding he already knew. He always talked himself out of it by morning, telling himself that a woman who wanted to fix something would have said so, would have reached for him instead of retreating further every week. It was a tidy piece of logic, and like most tidy logic built to protect a person from an uncomfortable truth, it was almost entirely wrong. Ruth Caldwell mentioned once, almost in passing, that in her experience the quietest divorces were rarely about a lack of love, but Marcus had dismissed the comment at the time, assuming his own situation was the exception, rather than the rule she was describing. He signed the retainer anyway, scheduled the appraisal anyway, kept moving forward through each procedural step, because stopping to question any single one of them would have meant admitting he was not as certain as he needed to appear. He went back to the house that afternoon only because he had forgotten his father's watch, a plain steel piece with a cracked leather band that had outlived the man who wore it for 30 years before Marcus inherited it. He noticed Patricia's sedan parked at the curb before he even reached the driveway, and his first instinct was to keep driving, to avoid an encounter that could only be uncomfortable, given everything unfolding between him and her daughter. Patricia had never fully accepted the marriage, not from the very beginning, and over 11 years she had never quite let Marcus forget it, offering opinions no one asked for at holidays and birthdays, with the practiced ease of someone who believed she was always right. He sat in his car at the end of the block for a full minute, engine idling, debating whether the watch was worth the discomfort of walking past her. But it was his father's watch, one of the only things he had left of the man, and some decisions are made by the heart faster than the mind can argue against them. Marcus parked around the corner instead of in the driveway, an old habit from years of avoiding exactly this kind of unnecessary tension, and let himself in through the side door near the kitchen, rather than the front entrance. He moved quietly through the house, not out of any plan to eavesdrop, but simply because quiet had become his default setting inside those walls. He could hear voices drifting from the living room before he reached the hallway, Patricia's voice unmistakable, even muffled through a doorway, sharp and certain in the way it had always been. He paused near the kitchen counter, close enough now to make out full sentences, and something in the tone stopped him before he could decide whether to announce his presence or slip back out the way he came. The words reached him clearly then, cutting through the ordinary hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the clock on the wall. "Are you really planning to stay with him for the rest of your life?" Patricia asked again, this time with an edge of exasperation, as though she had asked some version of this question many times before and never gotten the answer she wanted. Marcus stood absolutely still in that kitchen, one hand still resting on the counter, his own heartbeat suddenly louder in his ears than either voice in the next room. Patricia continued before Danielle could even respond, her words sharp and dismissive, in a way that made something in Marcus's chest tighten instantly. "He isn't worth what you're giving up," Patricia said. "Why should you keep sacrificing yourself for a man who barely notices you anymore?" Marcus felt the folded divorce papers in his jacket pocket, still there from the signing that morning, and he pressed his fingers against them without meaning to, as if checking that they were real. He braced himself for Danielle's answer, expecting agreement, expecting some tired confirmation of everything he had already convinced himself was true. Instead, he heard his wife's voice, steady and clear in a way it had not sounded around him in months, cutting straight through her mother's certainty, like it was nothing at all. "Because I love him," Danielle said, and the 4 words landed on Marcus like something physical, knocking the breath briefly out of him where he stood. He heard Patricia start to respond, some dismissive sound of disbelief, but Danielle kept going before her mother could finish, her voice gaining a strength Marcus had not heard from her since long before the silence between them began. "He has no idea," Danielle continued, "that for the last 2 years, he's been the reason I survived at all." Marcus felt the floor tilt slightly beneath him, not literally, but in the way certain sentences can rearrange a person's entire sense of what has been happening around them. He wanted to walk into that room immediately, to demand an explanation, but something held him in place at the edge of the kitchen, some instinct that told him the truth would come faster if he simply stayed still and listened. "There are things," Danielle said quietly, "that he was never supposed to know, things I chose to carry by myself because I thought that was the right way to protect him." What unfolded over the following minutes reshaped everything Marcus believed about the last 2 years of his own life. Danielle explained to her mother, in a voice that kept catching and steadying itself again, a decision Marcus remembered clearly, but had always understood as an ordinary career choice. 3 years earlier, he had been offered a director position at a firm in another state, a genuine step up professionally, more money, and more prestige than his current role could offer him. He had turned it down without much internal debate at the time, telling Danielle simply that he wanted to stay close to her, that the timing did not feel right for either of them. He remembered her thanking him for it once, briefly, and then the subject had never come up again in 3 years of marriage. What he never knew, what he was hearing now for the first time standing frozen in his own kitchen, was that his decision had arrived at the exact moment Danielle needed it most, though she had never told him why. That same year, Danielle admitted quietly to her mother, she had been drowning in a depression so severe she had barely been able to leave the apartment on her worst mornings. The pressure of a brutal caseload at the firm had collided with an undiagnosed exhaustion that had been building for years, and somewhere in that collision, something inside her had simply broken. She had never told Marcus the full extent of it, had smiled through most mornings and pushed through most evenings, terrified that admitting the depth of it would make her seem weak in front of a man she respected so completely. If Marcus had taken that position and moved them across the country, away from the therapist she had finally started seeing and the fragile routine she had built to keep herself upright, she genuinely did not know if she would have made it through that year intact. I wasn't sure I would survive it, Danielle told her mother, her voice dropping lower, and he never even knew there was anything to survive. Marcus stood in the kitchen, with his hand pressed flat against the counter, replaying 3 years of memory through an entirely new lens, understanding for the first time that an ordinary decision he barely remembered making had quietly saved his wife's life. Danielle told her mother about one particular night, that winter, a detail she had never once shared with Marcus, even in the years since. She had sat on the bathroom floor of their old apartment for nearly 2 hours, unable to explain to herself why getting up felt impossible, while Marcus slept in the next room, believing she was simply working late at the office. She had found a therapist 2 weeks later, a woman named Dr. Okafor, and had gone to every appointment in secret, telling Marcus she was meeting clients when really she was learning, slowly, how to survive her own mind again. Patricia had known some of this at the time, had driven her to a handful of those early appointments herself, which was part of why she found it so difficult now to understand her daughter's continued loyalty to a man who, in her eyes, had never even noticed how close he came to losing her entirely. Danielle did not blame him for not noticing. She had built the concealment herself, brick by brick, out of love and out of shame, in equal measure, and she said as much to her mother now, her voice thick with an old exhaustion that had never fully left her. And that, Danielle said, her voice steadier now, was not even the largest thing she had never told him. Marcus held perfectly still, aware that whatever came next would matter more than anything he had heard so far. Patricia's voice softened slightly, though the disapproval in it had not fully disappeared. Curiosity now mixed in with her usual certainty. There are things a person can never fully explain to their own mother, Danielle said carefully, choosing her words the way she chose them in courtrooms, precisely and without waste. She began describing the last several months in a way Marcus had never once heard her describe them to him directly, admitting things she had apparently kept locked away even from her own husband. The distance Marcus had felt growing between them, Danielle explained, had nothing to do with love fading and everything to do with 2 separate crises she had been managing in complete silence. Her mother's declining health had worsened significantly that year, doctor's appointments stacking up quietly on weekday mornings that Danielle had never mentioned to Marcus at all. At the same time, she had been carrying the largest case of her career, a multi-year litigation that consumed entire weekends and demanded a kind of focus that left nothing over for anyone at home, including herself. She admitted to her mother that she had made a conscious decision somewhere in the middle of that chaos to protect Marcus from all of it, believing, in a way that now sounded foolish even to her own ears, that carrying the weight alone was a form of love rather than a betrayal of it. I thought if I kept it from him, Danielle said, he wouldn't have to suffer through it with me. But instead, I think I made him feel like I didn't want him there at all. It was, she admitted quietly, an enormous misjudgment, the kind that seemed reasonable in 1,000 small moments and catastrophic only once you added them all together. The illness itself, Danielle explained, had crept in slowly enough that even she had not taken it seriously at first, a series of dizzy spells and fatigue that Patricia insisted for months were simply the ordinary weight of getting older. It was only after a frightening fall in her own kitchen that Patricia finally agreed to the battery of tests that eventually produced a diagnosis, one that required regular monitoring and a schedule of specialists Danielle had quietly built her entire calendar around. At the same time, the case Danielle had been carrying at the firm involved a client whose entire company was at risk of collapse, a litigation so demanding that she had once gone 11 days without seeing daylight before 9 at night. She had made calculations in her own head that felt reasonable in isolation, that Marcus had enough on his own plate at work, that adding her mother's mortality and a career-defining case to his worries would only weigh him down without actually solving anything. Looking back on it now, standing in front of her own mother, finally saying all of it out loud, she recognized how thoroughly that logic had backfired. How the very silence meant to protect him had instead convinced him she no longer wanted him near her at all. Patricia, unmoved by any of it, pressed her case again, insisting that none of this justified staying in a marriage that looked, from where she was sitting, thoroughly lifeless. Danielle's response this time carried none of the earlier hesitation, only a firmness that made Marcus's chest ache with something between grief and disbelief. "I already prepared something for him," Danielle said, something she had been working on quietly for weeks, something meant to finally say aloud everything she had been unable to say in person. Marcus did not yet know what she meant, but the sentence lodged itself in his mind immediately, and he found himself holding his breath as Patricia finally, reluctantly, rose to leave. He waited in the kitchen until he heard the front door close and Patricia's car pull away from the curb outside, giving himself a moment before he moved. Danielle had not yet realized he was in the house, and Marcus stood there, weighing whether to announce himself immediately or to see, quietly, what she had meant by something prepared. He stepped carefully into the hallway and noticed a small wooden box sitting open on the dining room table, one Danielle must have been going through before her mother arrived unannounced. Inside it, Marcus found a photo album he had never seen before, filled with pictures from across their entire relationship, arranged with the kind of care that takes weeks rather than hours. Beneath the album sat several handwritten letters, folded neatly, along with both of their wedding rings, cleaned and polished, until they caught the afternoon light coming through the window. Tucked beneath everything else was a pair of tickets to a resort neither of them had ever visited together, dated for the weekend of their upcoming 12th anniversary, an anniversary Marcus had assumed, until that exact moment, would never actually arrive. He turned the pages of the photo album slowly, recognizing pictures he had forgotten existed, a blurry shot from their honeymoon, a candid moment at Terrence's wedding, where Danielle was laughing at something just out of frame. Each page had a small handwritten caption beneath it, dates and short notes in her familiar slanted script, the kind of quiet documentation that takes real time and real intention to assemble. Near the back of the album, tucked into a plastic sleeve, was a printed itinerary for the resort trip, complete with a spa appointment booked for the two of them together and a dinner reservation on the exact date of their anniversary. Marcus realized, looking at the careful planning laid out in front of him, that whatever had been happening behind her silence over the past several months, indifference toward their marriage had never been part of it. Somewhere underneath all the distance he had spent so long interpreting as an ending, she had been quietly building toward a beginning again, one he had almost destroyed, with a signature 2 hours earlier. He stood over that box for a long time, feeling something break open in his chest that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with grief for how badly he had misread the last several months of his own life. His hands were shaking slightly as he lifted one of the letters from the pile, recognizing Danielle's handwriting immediately, small and slanted and familiar from 1,000 notes left on kitchen counters over the years. He unfolded it carefully, and it did not take long to understand that this particular letter had never been intended for him to find like this, unfinished and raw, in a way that suggested she had written it for herself as much as for him. "If you ever leave, thinking I stopped loving you," the letter began, "please know that isn't true and never has been." Danielle had written about trying to be strong for both of them during a year that nearly broke her, about believing silence was protection rather than the quiet wound it eventually became. She apologized, in ink that blurred slightly in places where something wet had clearly touched the page before it dried, for never learning how to ask for help even from the one person who had never once refused to give it to her. Marcus read every line twice, standing alone in that dining room, with the box open in front of him and the divorce papers still folded in his jacket pocket. He understood, reading her private, unfinished confession, that what had nearly ended their marriage had never been betrayal or indifference, but two people who loved each other well enough and communicated badly enough to nearly lose everything over silence alone. The realization did not arrive as relief exactly, not yet, but as something heavier and more complicated, grief for the months they had both spent suffering separately when they could have been suffering together instead. He was still holding the letter, unmoving, when he heard the front door open again behind him. Danielle walked in expecting an empty house, the way she had walked into countless empty houses over the past several months, and stopped completely still the moment she saw Marcus standing there with the letter in his hand. Her face went through several things in quick succession. Confusion first, then recognition of what he was holding, then something closer to fear than anything Marcus had seen from her in years. Neither of them spoke for what felt like a long time, though it could not have been more than a few seconds. Both of them simply looking at each other across a room that suddenly felt much smaller than it had that morning. Danielle's eyes filled before she said a single word, and when she finally spoke, her voice came out cracked, in a way Marcus had genuinely never heard from her in 11 years of marriage. "You heard?" she said, not quite a question, and Marcus nodded once, still holding the letter carefully, like something that might tear if he moved too fast. What followed was not an argument, not the kind of conversation either of them had braced for during months of silent distance. It was, instead, the first real conversation they had shared in nearly a year, both of them finally saying out loud the things they had been carrying separately for far too long. Danielle told him everything in full now, the depression from 3 years earlier, her mother's declining health, the case that had consumed her every waking hour, the shame she carried over, never finding the words to ask him for help. Marcus told her, in turn, about the colleague's comment that had planted a seed of certainty in him, about the divorce papers folded in his jacket pocket at that exact moment, about assuming for months that her silence meant she had simply stopped wanting him around. He admitted, for the first time out loud, how he had counted every missed dinner and every short text as further proof of an ending, how he had built an entire case against their marriage, the same methodical way he approached a construction project, brick by brick, until the conclusion felt inevitable rather than chosen. Danielle listened without interrupting, and when he finished, she told him, quietly, that she had noticed him pulling away too, had assumed at times that his silence meant he had already checked out and was simply waiting for the right moment to leave. Neither of them had been wrong about the distance. They had only been wrong about the reason for it, each one privately certain the other had stopped caring, when in truth both of them had simply stopped talking. Danielle admitted she had nearly shown him the box a dozen times over the past month, had stood outside the home office door more than once, with her hand raised to knock, before losing her nerve and walking away. Marcus told her he wished she had knocked, and she told him she wished he had asked, and somewhere in that exchange of small regrets, something between them finally began to loosen. Neither of them raised their voice once during the entire conversation, though both of them cried, openly and without embarrassment, in a way neither had allowed themselves to do in front of the other for a very long time. Marcus reached into his jacket at some point and pulled out the folded papers, setting them on the table between them without a word, and Danielle looked at them for a long moment before reaching over and tearing them cleanly in half. Neither of them said anything particularly dramatic in that moment. No grand declarations, just two exhausted people finally putting down weight they had been carrying alone for far too long. Marcus crossed the room and pulled her into him, and she let herself be held in a way she had not allowed herself to be held in months, her shoulders finally dropping the tension they had been holding since before either of them could remember. "I'm sorry," she said quietly into his shoulder, and he told her he was sorry too, for assuming the worst instead of simply asking her what was actually happening underneath the silence. It was not a fixed marriage in that single moment. Not entirely, but it was, for the first time in a long while, an honest one again. A year later, the two of them sat together most Tuesday evenings in a small office downtown, across from a marriage counselor named Dr. Alvarez, who had a quiet, patient way of asking the kinds of questions neither of them had learned to ask each other on their own. They were learning, slowly and sometimes clumsily, how to say out loud when something hurt, instead of quietly disappearing into separate rooms and separate silences. Marcus learned to ask directly when Danielle came home late, instead of building a case against her in his own head. Danielle learned to say she was struggling before the struggle became invisible weight she carried alone. Learned that asking for help was not the same thing as failing the people she loved. Patricia, too, had softened somewhat once she finally understood the full picture. Once Danielle sat her mother down and explained everything that had happened during those months of silence and near collapse. It was not instant forgiveness or instant understanding on anyone's part, but it was a beginning, the slow and deliberate work of rebuilding something that had nearly been lost entirely. Dr. Alvarez had a habit of asking each of them, near the end of every session, to name one thing they had been afraid to say out loud that week. In the beginning, the answers came slowly, guarded, the old habits of silence still pulling at both of them, even in a room built specifically to undo that silence. Over time, though, Marcus found himself telling Danielle things he once would have swallowed, that he had felt invisible during her worst months, that he had been afraid of becoming a man his own father had been, someone who disappeared quietly rather than fought for what mattered. Danielle, in turn, admitted how frightened she had been of appearing weak in front of him, how she had built her entire adult life around being the person who handled things rather than the person who needed help. They fought sometimes in that office, honestly and out loud, instead of silently in separate rooms, and each fight left them somehow closer rather than further apart, because at least now the fighting meant they were still trying. Patricia came to one session near the end of that year, at Danielle's invitation, and sat across from Marcus for nearly an hour, listening to things about her daughter's health she had never fully understood even as her own mother. She left that session quieter than she arrived, and though she never became a woman who freely praised her son-in-law, she stopped, from that point forward, asking Danielle why she stayed. They used the tickets from the wooden box that same year, arriving at the resort on the exact weekend Danielle had originally planned, though everything about the trip felt different now than it would have felt if she had simply handed him the box without him ever overhearing anything at all. Marcus watched her on the balcony their first evening there, the ocean behind her turning the color of the sky, and found himself thinking that he had almost traded this. All of it, the 12 years and whatever years might still come after, for a single misunderstanding neither of them had bothered to correct out loud. Danielle brought the unfinished letter with her on that trip, tucked into her bag without mentioning it, and one night after dinner she finally read the rest of it aloud to him, finishing the sentences she had abandoned months earlier when the writing had become too painful to continue. Marcus listened without interrupting, the way he was still learning to do, and when she finished, he told her that he did not need the ending of that letter to be perfect, only that he needed her to keep writing to him instead of writing around him. They renewed their vows quietly the following spring, nothing large or public, just the two of them, and a small gathering of family standing in the same backyard where they had married 9 years earlier, the same string lights rehung for the occasion. Terence stood beside Marcus that day and told him, quietly, that he was glad his brother had turned the car around for a watch he almost did not need after all. Marcus wore that same watch at the ceremony, its cracked leather band replaced, but the steel case left exactly as it was, and he found it fitting that something so ordinary had ended up marking the day everything nearly ended and the day it began again. Marcus came to understand, looking back on everything that had happened, that he had once believed a marriage ends the moment love disappears. What he learned instead, sitting in that counselor's office week after week, relearning how to talk to the woman he had almost walked away from, was something quieter and more difficult. A marriage does not usually end because love runs out. It ends, more often, in the space where two people stop telling each other that they are hurting, where silence gets mistaken for peace, instead of recognized as the warning sign it actually is. He kept the torn halves of that divorce petition in a drawer in his desk, not as a memorial to the day he nearly lost his wife, but as a reminder of something far more useful. Sometimes a marriage that looks completely finished from the outside only needs one honest conversation to prove that it was never actually over at all. He thought often, in the years that followed, about how close the two of them had come to becoming a story other people told as a cautionary tale, two good people who simply stopped talking until there was nothing left to save. He thought about Gregory's offhand comment at the bar, about Ruth Caldwell's careful questions, about every small piece of evidence he had gathered against a marriage that had never actually been guilty of what he accused it of. He thought about the version of that afternoon where he had simply driven past the house without stopping for a watch he did not truly need, where the papers would have been filed the following Thursday, and neither of them would have ever known what the other had been carrying. Danielle told him once, much later, that she had almost given up trying to explain herself that same week, had nearly decided that whatever they once had was already too far gone to bother reaching for. Instead, a forgotten watch and an unlocked side door had given both of them one more chance to say the things they had spent months not saying, and neither of them ever again mistook silence for peace. What Marcus carried forward from all of it, more than the torn papers in his desk drawer, was the understanding that love rarely dies loudly. It goes quiet first, and it is in that quiet, more than anywhere else, that two people either choose each other again or lose each other for good.